Look up. Looking up, genuine upward comparison, the kind that generates realistic aspiration, requires a sufficiently stable self-concept that the process does not feel threatening. When the primary strategy is to look down for safety, the habit of looking up for direction atrophies. The person becomes invested in the comparative disadvantage of others in a way that serves their immediate comfort, but slowly narrows their field of possibility. There is a second cost that is rarely examined. Downward social comparison changes how you perceive the people you are comparing yourself to. Research on social perception shows that deliberately finding others' deficits and failures to use for self-elevation activates a consistent pattern of subtle dehumanization, unconscious but measurable in how those people are subsequently described, judged, and treated. When you use another person's difficulty as psychological material for your own comfort, something shifts in how fully you can see them as a complete human being. They become, in a cognitive sense, a reference point rather than a person. And that shift happens in your mind, not in them. It is always you who changes, not them. The research on empathy and social cognition consistently shows that treating others primarily as comparison objects, even downward ones, erodes the capacity to take their perspective accurately and with care. This means that a strategy used to feel more secure among other people is simultaneously undermining the very infrastructure required to actually connect with them. None of this means that downward social comparison is always destructive. Research distinguishes between benign and exploitative versions of the process. Benign downward comparison occurs when someone in genuine distress recognizes that others face similar or greater challenges, and that recognition meaningfully reduces the whom things are clearly worse. The mechanics of this process were studied in detail by Thomas Wills at Fordham University in 1981, who coined the term downward comparison and mapped the conditions under which it most reliably occurs. Wills found that people experiencing threats to their self-esteem were significantly more likely to spontaneously seek out information about others who were performing worse, experiencing more hardship, or occupying a lower social position. They were not simply passively noticing these comparisons. They were actively seeking them. The mind under threat scans the social environment for evidence that others are worse off, not out of malice, but out of urgent need to relocate itself somewhere safe on the social hierarchy. Wills also found that the effect was strongest when the threat was specifically to the domain being compared. Someone who feels professionally threatened seeks downward comparison in the professional domain. Someone who feels socially excluded seeks evidence that others are more isolated. This comparison is targeted, highly efficient, and acutely self-serving. The most uncomfortable finding in the research is what downward comparison actually produces. In the short term, it works remarkably well. Studies consistently show that it reliably reduces anxiety, restores a sense of relative adequacy, and increases positive effect. This is precisely why it is so widely and automatically used. The brain discovers early in development that this strategy reliably delivers relief, and it returns to it whenever the conditions that require it reappear. But the relief is structural. It depends on maintaining a mental picture of others as below you in some relevant dimension. And that dependency has consequences that accumulate invisibly over time. Research shows that people who rely heavily on downward social comparison tend to resist the kind of growth that would require them to. There is a specific moment when you feel relieved, not because something good happened to you, but because something bad happened to someone else. You see a colleague make a serious mistake in a meeting, and for the briefest fraction of a second, before the concern arrives, before the appropriate reaction assembles itself, you feel something that resembles comfort. You hear that someone who always seemed ahead of you is struggling, and you notice a loosening in your chest that has nothing to do with sympathy. Someone who intimidated you professionally fails publicly, and the world reorganizes itself into a slightly more manageable shape. These moments feel shameful precisely because you recognize what they are. These reactions are not accidents. They are strategy, and the psychological research on this strategy, its mechanics, its costs, and its consequences is more revealing than most people are prepared to discover about themselves. Psychologists call it downward social comparison. The concept was first formally theorized by Leon Festinger in 1954, who proposed that human beings evaluate their own opinions and abilities by comparing themselves to others. Festinger's original framework for this was largely neutral. People compare upward to aspirational figures and downward to those doing worse, and each type serves a fundamentally different function. Upward comparison tends to motivate. Downward comparison tends to protect. What researchers discovered in the decades that followed was that the downward direction is far more commonly used than most people acknowledge, that operates largely outside conscious awareness, and that it serves not merely as occasional comfort, but as a fundamental mechanism of self-regulation under threat. When the self feels diminished, when competence is in question, status is uncertain, identity feels unstable, the brain reaches automatically and urgently for the one comparison that restores the feeling of adequacy. Someone for isolation of suffering. It is the mechanism behind support groups and the relief of knowing you're not uniquely broken. Exploitative downward comparison occurs when someone uses another person's disadvantage not to locate themselves within a shared human condition, but to feel superior to a specific other. The internal difference between these two forms is subtle. The behavioral and relational consequences are very much not. One builds connection across shared difficulty. The other feeds a quiet hunger that is never quite satisfied, because whatever comparison was used for comfort will eventually stop working, and a newer and sharper one will be needed. What disrupts the cycle is not the suppression of the impulse. Research on thought suppression consistently shows that trying not to think about something reliably increases the frequency of thinking about it. The real disruption comes instead from developing the kind of internal stability that makes the comparison less necessary. When the self-concept is anchored in what you have actually done, thought, and chosen, rather than in your position relative to others, the threat that triggers downward comparison loses much of its power. The need to look down at someone else in order to feel adequate is proportional to how much your sense of adequacy depends on that comparison in the first place. Reduce the dependency, and the comparison loses its urgency. That reduction is not a realization. It is a practice of evaluating yourself by internal standards rather than social ones, of tolerating the discomfort of uncertainty without immediately reaching for a comparison that settles it. The brain's habit of looking down for comfort is ancient and efficient. Replacing it requires something slower and more deliberate. But the alternative, a life organized around the disadvantage of others, is one of the quietest, most persistent, and most corrosive traps in all of human psychology.